Hello to XYZ and IY, Tutra, Mama, and Logic, and Diane. Hello to all of you. Well, I'm really excited about this video that I'm going to present with you today. I've been looking forward to this literally for months. I've had to keep it under wraps. It is to do with AJ Juice's paper. I see that the audio is good. Thanks, XYZ. That's good. It's to do with AJ Juice's latest paper. It's literally hot off the press, and it is called Iran's Poisoned Qibla Arrows. It was released, I think it was yesterday, or it might have been the day before. I think it was yesterday. So not literally hot off the press. Now, most of what you're going to see is totally in line with what you've been hearing on the channel for the last few months. We're going to be looking at Qibla data. Now, it's interesting when AJ Juice introduces Qibla data, he's essentially saying it's inadmissible evidence, but it's part of his argument. And the reason why he's doing that is because, there's always a danger that, people can misuse Qibla data. He's more interested in the why of the Qibla data. And I haven't had a chance to read the entire paper, so I'm going to be kind of going through it with you. I'm picking out the key points. The paper is about 90 pages long, so it's quite a big paper. So I'll be doing it chunk at a time, and hopefully, just focusing on the essentials and trying to maybe add a little bit of my own sort of thoughts to make it more comprehensible. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get stuck into it. And hello to Dragon and Catholic and Orthodox Faiths and Carol B. Okay, I'll be checking in on the chat every so often, but let's get started. Okay. Now, thought it might be good to introduce a quote from The Art of War. All warfare is based on deception. I think that's going to be a theme across much of this paper, that a lot of people have been deceived. History has been rewritten. Things have been hidden, often in plain sight. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of pushback. There's going to be a lot of people that will want to hang on to the traditions, even in the face of the data that contradicts the traditions. That's to be expected. And many of us here are, we've been following this for a number of years, so we don't even realize all that we know, that most Muslims or even just general members of the public are not aware of. So this is really out there for them. This is going to be quite a hard pill to swallow. But I suppose the thing is, we need to be just really patient. Where you can get AJ Juice's paper is in academia.edu. I'll put a link to his paper after I finish the live stream. So if you can bear with me, I'll put it in the description afterwards. I forgot to do that. Okay, so let's get into it then. So my title for this part is "The Facts Are the Facts, Nothing Personal." This is essentially what AJ Juice is saying here. He says, while this paper is about discoveries vaguely related to Qiblas, its implications are either career suicidal or paradigm changing, perhaps both. So much so that I put a statement of where I stand in my concluding remarks of this work. The big picture that emerges is so horrifying. This is powerful stuff. So horrifying that many will perceive it as anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim bigotry at first. I apologize to the Jewish and Muslim community that what boils to the surface is deeply hurtful to their sentiments and shocking to everyone else. It also presents a once-in-generations opportunity to find understanding and peace through lessons that can be taken from purely evidence and data-driven history. So, in other words, what AJ Juice is saying, that this has not been driven by any sort of anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim bigotry. is purely looking at the data and trying to draw conclusions from the data. It's nothing personal. And I hope that all of you kind of view it that way, and use this knowledge in that spirit. All right. So with that out of the way, he says in this key part here, he says that these leaders designed Islam as a tool for division. That's the key point here. So what is he saying? What has been discovered during the last few years should never have been hidden in the first place and unearthed centuries ago. Deep into the Abbasid era and beyond, early Islam is nothing but the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, with a new covenant under Jewish leadership engaged in a religio-political cartel. That's a strong word, cartel there, that spans deeper than we could ever have imagined. In an inconceivable power game in which ordinary Jews are abused as cannon fodder, these leaders designed Islam as a tool for division. So I think this is a very important point. This is not it's not an anti-Semitic thing. It's recognizing there were leaders that fooled everyone, even including their own. And it was only the really knowledgeable within the higher echelons that knew what was going on. Everything was coded. So most people didn't know exactly what was happening. While Jewish leaders swam in unimaginable riches by magnitudes greater than the modern super rich, the rest were conditioned to accept intellectual poverty and serfdom through religious indoctrination. Plainly, Abbasid caliphs were plain Jewish Mohammeds, who were leaders in a chain of Jewish Mohammeds, from the only family tree that had the standing to establish messiahs. The Hasmonean Hashemites coming through the post-Kopsha revolt Marsutran family. That's quite a lot to take in. This paper opens a small window that demonstrates with mosque orientations that Muslims were literally praying. It's kind of funny, but I'm sure it's not meant to be funny. Muslims were literally praying to their Jewish overlords. So in other words, we're praying in the direction of the Jewish leaders like the Nazis and the Exilarchs. But it goes far beyond Islam. It emerges nearly everywhere. The Jewish diaspora established a substantial bridgehead, a deliberately chosen word of religio-political warfare, certainly in the narrow perspective of this paper. Okay, so let's try and take this in. He's basically saying there that the Abbasid caliphs were plain Jewish Mohammeds. In other words, they were acting as Jewish Mohammeds, okay? Mahmeds, okay? And there wasn't just one Muhammad, there was a chain of these Jewish Mohammeds. Now, we saw the evidence for that in the Chinese sources. They talk about multiple Mohammeds. When one died, another one replaced him. So, we'll see more about that later. Every so often, I'll check back into the chat just to see how we're doing. Political messianism as psyop by corrupt Hasmoneans. That's it in a nutshell. And Vilnius has said, straight up Gnostic then. So there's a lot of Gnosticism in this, in the sense of hiddenness. Okay, and I'm sure many of you have seen Lloyd's work on that. So it's definitely, he's on the right track there. Okay, so a little bit further. We are told that medieval Muslims could not orient buildings precisely, and that modern Qibla directions are irrelevant for interpreting historical mosques. These claims are unsubstantiated. Fact is that many mosques in Iran are precisely oriented toward Baghdad, Narbonne in France, or Girona in Spain, literally dozens. Okay, so I think the argument that they couldn't do those orientations is wrong. It shows a lack of understanding of the technology of the time. But if you can do something, even if another person doesn't understand how you achieve something, the fact is, if you can show that you've done something, you've done something. And they're talking here about creating buildings in a particular precise direction. Now, we don't know exactly how they were doing it, but my guess is that they were using star constellations to figure out the exact time so that they could get the longitude and latitudes necessary to be able to precisely locate buildings. That's my sense, but maybe we'll find out more about that later. Now, let's move on. Okay. So, in a nutshell, there are qiblas pointing to Baghdad. These are actually qiblas from mosques across Iran there. The dot there to the left is Baghdad. XYZ says, I thought early qiblas face Petra or Jerusalem. This is Dan Gibson's thesis. A.J. Juice, when he gathered the data for qiblas, had no preconception about where he expected to find qiblas. All he did was he measured up hundreds and hundreds of the mosque walls and then let the chips fall wherever they may fall. As you will see later, the database that he has gathered is multiple times larger than Dan Gibson's. So there might be some qiblas that Dan Gibson has that are misdiagnosed as pointing to Petra. They might actually be pointing somewhere else, you know. So we'll come back to Dan Gibson a little bit later, actually. We'll see a bit more on that. Now, there are also qiblas pointing to Narbonne in France, and look where they're coming from. Qiblas from as far away as Iran, pointing to Narbonne. Like, what's that about? Who'd have thought? Okay, and you just imagine the difficulty to get multiple mosques all pointing in that direction. We're saying mosques here. We're assuming these were mosques. Were they mosques? Were they synagogues? Or was it a hybrid between the two? And then we have qiblas pointing to Narbonne, and these are coming from synagogues in Spain. Okay, so you can see that there's quite a lot going on here that we don't know about. So I think it's worth pointing out, folks, that this is literally a world first here, what I'm sharing with you. This has never been shared before online. As I said at the beginning, the paper is hot off the press. It's literally like just been published 24 hours ago or thereabouts. Okay. So the Narbonne connection is intriguing. I remember visiting it a number of years ago and found it a beautiful city, very fascinating. Never suspected that it had, you know, what we're going to discover later here. So this is quite amazing. Yes, hit the like button, please, folks. That would be a great help. Thank you. Now, let's move on. Now, while the facts of the data are interesting, the pressing question that this paper attempts to answer is why. That's the big question. Modern research is unable to answer it because it is not declaring Muslim traditions, and I love this phrase, as a pile of rotten pomegranates. I'm sure he probably had other words in mind, which said, oh, we'll call it rotten pomegranates, but we must figure out what was covered up for Muslims and Jews to merit being pulled around their noses. That is our job. So it's been covered up for the ordinary Muslim, the ordinary Jew. The leaders hid what was really going on. And let's be honest, most people just go about their daily lives and don't have the time or capacity to investigate what is going on in their times. You know, it's the leaders are the ones that do all this sort of stuff, and it's often hidden away in rooms and, you know, in private discussions, you know. So he says then that the paper Surah 2, Many Qiblas, established that the orientations of early mosques seem to have followed the location of the divine presence, which happened to have overlapped with the locations of Jewish exilarchs and Nazis. I did some videos on Surah 2, Many Qiblas, quite a while ago. It found that the Quran left room for changing orientations and is not restricted to just one holy location. The close relationship between the Jewish leadership and mosque orientations triggered questions about whether researchers can distinguish a mosque from a synagogue when no additional archaeological evidence would support either of them. With the paper Monuments of Jihad, an attempt was made to verify the methodology of the data on neutral ground. It needed to be removed from the actions of early Islam and relatively free of sectarian intermixture. By following practically every significant mosque of note in the Ottoman realm, the majority of mosques could be attributed to the whereabouts of sultans, often at war, and matched with dates of historical importance. Just on that, there are some mosques that were built during Ottoman times that pointed to Malta at a time when they were trying to conquer Malta, for example. So this is quite incredible. So we really will have to change our ideas about Qiblas. This idea that it was just towards the Kaaba is wrong. It was the Shekinah, the holy presence, the divine presence that was important, and that was considered the Jewish leader, the exilarch, or the Nasi meaning prince. Okay, that was the key thing. When the holiest place of Mecca first showed up in the data, it did so late. Sorry, I'll say that again. It did so late that the underlying methodology needed to be questioned again. 16th century late and still inconsistent. So what he's hinting at there is that Mecca, or at least the Qiblas to Mecca, are an awful lot later than we can possibly imagine. And that prior to this, there were Qiblas pointing to the exilarch and so on, and the Nasi. Okay, just have a look at your messages. I see here that you've got, this was an elite interest. Yeah, it definitely wouldn't have been something that the commoners would have had any knowledge or interest in. Okay. Yeah, just curious here about this one here. Rennes-le-Château is about 50 kilometers from Narbonne. That would be something to dig into. Can you tell us something about Rennes-le-Château? I'm not sure what the significance there is. Okay. And an analogous area of history are the intrigues of Hasmoneans with Romans against Greek potentates. Anything else here? Okay, another question, which is a good one. I wonder about how exact the measurements are, how far plus and minus from Narbonne. We'll come to that. That's actually a really important question. Yeah, so coming to that later in the paper. Let's carry on. So primary evidence indicates that the Kaaba didn't form the direction of prayer. Okay, this is the point here. Consensus and tradition tell us that the Kaaba, the Qibla of all Muslims, forms the direction of prayer on the earth, right? Therefore, all of the Islamic sacred places are shaped according to its direction. Moreover, in many cases, it also shapes the direction of houses or the general orientation of whole cities. Primary evidence from the 12th century AD tells us that this is not so. Theories that are trying to argue a single focal point are missing out on the potential for significant discoveries to be made as a consequence of precise and purely data-driven approaches that must ignore any predetermined targets, such as Petra, for example. He's obviously having a little bit of a dig there at Gibson, and the argument here he's making is that Dan his methodology was assuming the Qiblas are pointing to Petra and then doing the searching, looking for that answer. It's far better to actually not assume where it's pointing to and just record the data and try and record as much of it as possible. Okay. So So I think the key takeaway here is that primary evidence from the 12th century indicates that this whole Kaaba Qibla thing wasn't a thing then, like in the 12th century. A good source, and I'm sure this is who he's referring to by the 12th century, would be Benjamin of Tudela. And in Benjamin of Tudela's writings of his travels to Baghdad, he basically says that the pilgrims were coming from all over to see the caliph's face, right? Not to see Mecca or the Kaaba, but that was their primary objective. Okay, and that fits in with everything else that we've seen. Now, this is in answer to that question about precision. He says, like in my previous papers, only the orientation of the buildings themselves is taken into consideration, including structural variations. Qibla niches are ignored for their mutability, which means like you can move a niche around, you can move, different indicators of a niche. That's not really reliable. The walls are the thing that you can be more secure with. Since the construction dates of too many mosques in Iran are unknown or unstable, the collection was assembled with a dragnet method, essentially scooping up over 600 notable mosques or religious buildings in medieval city cores across Iran. Now, 600 is a lot. Okay. The here presented mosques needed to meet a stringent criterion of plus or minus 0.25 degrees. Right. We're not talking about 25 degrees or 5 degrees or 1 degree. He's talking about a quarter of 1 degree, plus or minus. That's the standard he's applying here. Now, he says it aligns it with the margin of error from surveys on the ground. Okay. Now, he also says here that a lot of his current work is based on previous work that he did that no one else had produced. So literally, he's a trailblazer. He hasn't got any others to kind of back up a lot of what he's finding. Okay, so he says, given my specialization in the discovery of the economics of organized religion, my approach is different from most of my peers. Different, not better. It focuses on the big picture of money and power rather than on word analysis and spiritual questions. There is nobody to quote for Qibla orientations that point to spiritual leaders. That was his big find. Nobody for the Doctrina Jacobi being an inner Jewish document for the constitution of proto-Islam, created for distribution in synagogues throughout the diaspora. Again, that was his big finding. Nobody for the 7th century provenance of the Jerusalem Talmud, Barakot. Again, some scholars are saying it was all done and dusted in the 4th or 5th century. Okay. Nobody for the Marzutran chain of Mohammeds. Nobody for the Ottoman era creation of the inscriptions inside the Dome of the Rock. Something that hasn't yet been widely accepted. A lot of people poo-pooed that idea, but will they continue to poo-poo it in light of what we're going to discover in this paper, I wonder? Nobody for the Jewish Talmudic nature of concealment in the Quran. In other words, he was able to detect that the Quran operates according to a Talmudic style of concealment of ideas and words and names and so forth. Nobody for the name of the Marzutran, Salman al-Farisi, attesting to him being Jewish, Pharisee. Yeah, the list goes on. While I embrace the high probability of being wrong for the sake of progress, I advise studying the material with a tolerance for errors. So what he's saying is, look at the big picture. There may be minor errors here and there that are unavoidable, but if he gets 80% of it right, it's definitely going to change the picture of what actually happened. And I think that's what he most wants to achieve in the end. So just checking your messages here. So Vilnius says that's also consistent with a late Mecca, i.e., the Caliph being the defining direction. When the Caliph sets up in Mecca, therefore Qibla goes there. That's a good point, and that actually might indicate when Mecca was properly set up. Now, I did challenge AJ Juice about some of these ideas and said to him, but aren't there all these sources and documents that seem to be pointing to an earlier Mecca? And he was arguing, well, a lot of these documents are copied over the centuries, and it was very easy for someone to put an interpolation into the text because the originals would be lost and just the copies remain. So they're not as reliable as we would like to think. So let's go on from there then. So he says that the story starts in Baghdad and Narbonne. However, there's a single source that boosts my confidence infinitely, Benjamin of Tudela. One might think that he is far too late to have any bearing on proto-Islam. Instead, he constitutes the focal point to unravel its history and the pivot for a concise synthesis. I'd agree with him on that. Once you read the key passages in Benjamin of Tudela when he visited Baghdad, I think it really changes your perspective of what actually was going on. He says there is a story to tell with synagogue and mosque orientations that goes far beyond Mecca and the Kaaba. Ours starts in Baghdad, in Iraq, and Narbonne in France. Now, notice that here, in terms of the mosques in Iran, it's from a data set of 609 mosques, which is a pretty big collection. So these are Iranian qiblas, mosques with Baghdad layers. Okay, that, in other words, mosques with layers that point in the direction of Baghdad. There are scholarly arguments to be made and considered that it is simply not possible that mosques could be oriented toward a distant location with precision because they did not master these skills, that all mosques were intended to be oriented towards Mecca, and that modern mosque orientations are irrelevant. The problem with all these perhaps valid arguments is that they collide with facts from the ground. One of these simple facts is that 29 mosques in this data set contain construction layers that point toward Baghdad. Okay. These mosques are part of a data collection with 609 mosques across Iran. They are pointing to Baghdad with a margin of error of plus or minus 0.25 degree. Okay, so not the sort of margin of error that you'd expect in a case of coincidence, Now, for comparison, Dan Gibson's Qibla database has a data set of 250 in total. I've taken this screenshot from his latest book, Let the Stone Speak. All right. So according to him, he has a data set of 250. So AJ Juice's Iranian data set alone is just over twice that size, almost 3 times. But it doesn't just he doesn't just have an Iranian data set. So I don't know what his full total in his entire data set, but I would imagine it's running in the thousands. So it's a hugely important data set. Behind the scenes, I can tell you now that it's kind of in the public domain. I've been strongly persuading AJ Juice to publish his Qibla data, even if he considers the evidence inadmissible. It's hugely important, and I think you'll agree that it's good to have it out there. It certainly helps us to get the big picture, and I'm glad he did in the end with certain provisions put it out there. Now, one of the things that he was reluctant about publishing it was because of the lack of data in relation to when the mosque was built. But I think the direction in itself gives us some picture of what's going on, even if we don't know the exact year in some cases of when the mosques were built. It certainly tells us at least at some point in time there were mosques pointing towards Baghdad, and I think that is important, even if we can't be 100% certain when that was. Okay. Now, he goes on to say, it is impossible to argue these facts away. Even if half of these layers might turn out to be false positives, still a single factual orientation towards Baghdad should be enough for two questions. And these are, what is happening in Baghdad? In other words, why are they pointing towards Baghdad? And what about Mecca? So if they're pointing to Baghdad, what's happening with Mecca then? Surely Mecca should be where everything is pointing towards. Checking in with the chat again. Yeah. All right. So just going to get back to this. Now, he says, those who reject the here applied methodology fail to realize that I do not care too much whether the approach will turn out as valid. All that matters is that this perhaps false methodology may have brought forth hypotheses and evidence where those who adhere to tradition suffer from blind spots. I'm not using this data set as admissible evidence for lack of corroboration by other researchers other than for argument's sake. So in other words, he's putting it out there for argument's sake with the hope of building a hypothesis. Now, I'm sure others would be quite happy even to submit this evidence as admissible. But he's kind of stepping back and saying, okay, this is what we found. But he's saying, I don't think this evidence is enough, He goes on to say, however, two citizen scientists helped to establish that this data is indeed repeatable. Anyone with excess time that could be spent for more exciting things can sit down and verify or reject the data. I'm thankful and indebted to these two. A YouTuber by the name of Mel Sneakerman, who runs a channel called Islamic Origins, wonder who that is focused on research in early Islam, and Quiver, a beautiful mind who drives the world crazy with structural orientations that reach as far back as before the Bible. It is a perfect matchup of deranged minds that leads to perhaps not even asking the right questions, but asking questions that others do not ponder. I'm humbled to be in the company of these two people. But yeah, if asking questions that others haven't asked is what's needed, then I'm quite happy to be in that company. So he goes on to say that Isfahan and Shiraz stand out as large centers with such source orientations towards Baghdad. So these two places are key, Isfahan and Shiraz. For some reason, they especially have orientations pointing towards Baghdad. He says this data can be visualized in a map in which we see these mosques are not a regional occurrence. However, the southeastern part of Iran appears almost untouched. As you can see from this image, a lot of them are in other areas. Isfahan and Shiraz stand out as large centers with such source orientations towards Baghdad. I'm just going to check in on the comments again. Deranged minds, lol. Yeah. So, right. Islam, we would expect what I think I cut something off there. Let me just see what was at the beginning. No, okay. I've assumed that's the beginning of the sentence. Islam, we would expect to find such layers in obscure construction sections, even side buildings. However, in some mosques or religious buildings, it pertains to the main orientation, as in the example of the 12th century Sayyida Zainab Mosque in Sinjar, which is there on the right. None of these mosque orientations can be attributed to solstices, and each of them is by magnitudes off a path towards Mecca. Some of them as far off as over 40 degrees. So there's no chance that they were meant to point towards Mecca. While we know that the estimation method should have enabled builders to come within 1 degree of Mecca. all right, perhaps slightly more before the 10th century. So it's clearly not pointing towards Mecca, but it is towards Baghdad. Now, so here we have a lot of the key data. So we have got the names of the various mosques, their latitude, longitude, etc., and their Qibla direction. Okay, and these are all pointing towards Baghdad. Okay, I'm not going to go talk through each of them. I just shared with you so you have that as a source, and then continuing on another few here. Okay, and even more here, all pointing to Baghdad. So that's quite a lot. And again, he's saying that these are pointing within an error range of 0.25 degrees, which is nothing, like a tiny amount. So very accurate. Okay. Now, I argue that cannot be a coincidence to have so many pointed towards Baghdad, where the Exilarch lived and the Caliph lived. Okay. Now, next part of this is mosques with Narbonne layers. Okay, Narbonne being in southern France. The same survey of 609 mosques in Iran brings forth 33 mosques with construction layers that were oriented precisely towards Narbonne in France. These are again either main structures, side buildings, or building partitions that were added over time. This data can also be visualized in a map in which we see that the distribution of these mosques is across Iran, not just a regional occurrence. Okay, so it's quite a spread there. The absence of southeastern source orientations is again notable. So what's happening here? Well, we know that the Nasi, which is a Jewish leader, moved to Narbonne, and yet we have these mosques that are pointing like from thousands of miles away to the residence of a Jewish leader in southern France. So you draw your own conclusions. You know, what does that tell you about what's going on? None of these can be attributed to solstices, and each of them is by magnitude off a path towards Mecca, some of them as far as over 30 degrees. Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz stand out as large centers with such source orientations towards Narbonne. Now, my hunch is that Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz must have had significant Jewish populations, and this is the reason behind why they're pointing to Narbonne. I'm not sure if that's the way he argues later in the paper, but I guess that's probably where he's heading with that. 5 of these mosques are early 9th century or earlier. The Jama Mosque of Isfahan dated to 771 AD. The Jama Mosque of Ati in Shiraz is among them. It is a 9th century mosque and supposedly the oldest in Shiraz. It is said to have been built by the Safarid conqueror of Shiraz, Amroles, if I pronounce it correctly, between 889 AD and 894 AD. Its Qibla is straight to Narbonne in France. Okay, so that's a really early Qibla pointing to France, isn't it? Another one stands above all others, the Bibi Shahrbanu shrine in Ray, the claimed tomb of Shahrbanu. It has a construction layer that points to Narbonne. Now, this Shahrbanu is, I'm going to suggest, is a bit of a coded name, simply because of the meaning of the name Shahrbanu. Now, what's interesting here, I've done a little bit of digging. It may be that AJ Juice discusses this later in the paper. I don't know. So it'd be interesting as we get into the paper further if he's come to a similar conclusion as I. So what we're going to see is what the Shia tradition says about this person, Shahrbanu, and then what I was able to find that's parallel to this and what that reveals about, you know, the history being distorted, concealed, transformed, etc. Okay. So Shahrbanu, So her name is Persian. It means lady of the land. Okay. Was allegedly one of the wives of Hussein ibn Ali, the third Shia Imam, and supposedly the grandson of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. And what's key there, she was reportedly a Sassanid princess, a daughter of Yazdegerd III. Okay, now that's the bit that allows us to historically identify her and extract the real from the fake here. Okay, so let's go a little bit further into this. Right, so Yazdegerd III had a daughter called Dara that married who? Bostanay, who was the first exilarch of the Bostanay line. Okay, so in other words, Yazdegerd III's daughter married like the most important Jewish leader, the actual exilarch. Okay, now what's interesting is Bostanay's name is Aramized from the Persian bustan or Boston, which means garden. Is this why his wife is called Lady of the Land? You know, if you just imagine Lady of the Garden, like Lady of the Boston, it kind of makes sense. Maybe I might be stretching it there, but it seems like there's a cute little coded way of referring to her there that way. Okay, so instead of referring to her as Dara, which would be dead giveaway, if you understand the meaning of Boston, you could probably work out that her name there. Let's just go back one. Sharbanu, okay, Lady of the Land. That you know, if you knew enough, you could probably work out that it's a reference to her husband Boston, whose name means garden. Okay, hope that doesn't sound like too out there, but I think that's makes sense. You have Yazdegerd the third's daughter marrying an exilarch, but so okay, so he's an exilarch, but what does the Islamic tradition, the Shia tradition, call him? It calls Bostanay Hussein ibn Ali. So Hussein ibn Ali is actually a Jewish exilarch. Okay, he's not the third Shia Imam. He's the first of a particular line of exilarch, the Boston line. Okay, just going to come back to yeah, Mr. Sneaker Man. Yeah, I should point out I had to make up a name for myself, so that's my fake surname. On the Road to Boston is a good fiddle tune. I don't know it. I'll have to check that one out. No. Okay. So, was Hussein ibn Ali, the supposed third Shia Imam, actually Bostanay, the exilarch? I think that would be the case. I found this in a Jewish paper. This noble behavior found great favor in the king's eyes, and he appointed Bostanay exilarch. This incident is probably a veiled reference to Bostanay's lack of involvement in Haman's coup. The power to appoint judges for both Islamic and Jewish courts was granted to Bostanay, as it had been to Haman before him. Bostanay was to lead the academies of Sura and Pompedita, who were empowered to render judicial decisions for throughout the Islamic State. Now, this writer isn't fully divorced from the standard Islamic narrative, so there's a bit of a mixed bag here. But it's interesting that Bostanay led the academies of Sura and Pompedita and had huge sway at a key moment of that history. All right. Now, so further to that, then, as we mentioned, there was Iranian mosques, kiblas to Narbonne, okay, in France, and here are those mosques, okay, with all the data. All right. In some cases, we've got the year, okay. So I'm just going to leave that there for a moment, so you can take it. Of course, feel free to do screenshots of this. And here's some more. Okay, so again, a lot of different mosques pointing to Narbonne. Right, and here's some more. Okay, so you got lots of mosques, and just points you to the third one from the end there. It's pointing to Narbonne, and it's got a date of 1662 AD. That's very late. Still pointing to Narbonne. Yeah. Now, right. So, in addition, there's Iranian mosques with Girona or Girona layers. I don't know which it is. 19 mosques in the data set, 7 of which are overlapping with mosques that point to Narbonne, have layers that point to Girona or Girona in Spain. None of these mosques can be attributed to solstices, and each is. I think I lost you there for a second there. None of these mosques are regarded as early. Again, none can be attributed to solstices, and each is far off a Mecca Qibla. The southeast is again nearly deserted. Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz stand out as large centres with such source orientations towards Girona, Isfahan being the common denominator. Okay, so the big question then is, what is going on in Isfahan? All right. Sacre bleu, indeed. Yeah, interesting. Oh, the irony, France gave Ayatollah Khomeini sanctuary in 1978. They probably know a lot more than they let on. There's history there. Why does France have wine called Shiraz? Oops. I have lost my my PowerPoint there, so I'm just going to see if I can get it back again. So bear with me for a second. Now, does this stuff match the Al-Jirana? Let me just put this up. Does this stuff match the Al-Jirana theories of where Al-Aqsa really is? I've no idea. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by the Al-Jirana theories. I don't recognize that name, so I'll have to look into it further. Okay, so sorry about that. I don't know what happened there, but I lost where we're at. Just fell out of the stream, so just and come back to where we got to. Okay, where were we? I've forgotten where I got to. Narbonne. No, we're in Giron. Sorry, Giron. We've done this. Nearly there. Okay, we did that. Okay, we've seen that. Okay, I think it is. Save. No, I think we're go back a bit. Yeah, here I think we were, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Shah Banu's shrine complex has layers of both Narbonne and Girona. If the data were admissible as evidence, it could contribute to solving the mystery of who arrived in Narbonne only to move to Girona later. One might think that this must be random. It is not. If it was random, we could pick any location and we would find construction layers that point there with a long search bias. The data has been tested against possible targets of the divine presence. In the complete data set of Iran, there is not a single mosque with a layer that points to the Umayyad Palace in Damascus, perhaps one of the most significant royal residences in early Islam, not one. The mosque orientations towards Narbonne and Girona appear to also be unique to Iran. A preliminary survey shows that it appears rarely in Iraq and Syria or the Arab Peninsula. So there's something linking Iran with France, Narbonne and Girona, which is in Spain. Okay. Okay. So here's the appendix for those qiblas, so you can have a look at those. Hope you can see those fine in in YouTube or on YouTube. Okay, and here's a little bit more. Okay, now what about synagogues? There are Jewish synagogues with Narbonne layers. In other words, Jewish synagogues pointing to Narbonne. A survey of synagogue and mosque orientations in Spain shows that 11 synagogues or former synagogues were oriented precisely towards Narbonne. Many of them are not recognized as former synagogues today, but since they are in former Jewish quarters, there is a high confidence that these were synagogues indeed. Synagogues, mosques, and churches were investigated because functionaries of the Catholic Church claimed that these buildings were torn down. However, economics tells us that this is not how humans typically go about their business. They seek to reallocate valuable assets rather than to destroy them. So here is the map of those synagogues pointing to Narbonne. Similarly, as you find with the mosques, the table in Appendix D lists 11 synagogues from the data set in Spain that point to Narbonne. The data can be visualized with a map that shows that these Narbonne synagogues were not regional outliers, but distributed across Spain. We do not need to be concerned about these synagogues' construction dates. We do not know when most of them were built. For our purpose, it can be demonstrated that a set of synagogues were not oriented towards Jerusalem, as tradition suggests, but towards Narbonne. That's the key point. Of course, the prayers could still have been towards Jerusalem, but then an orientation of houses of worship towards a specific different location would be economically and spiritually redundant. So in other words, if they were praying towards Jerusalem, then why do they go to the bother of having them pointing towards Narbonne? Well, the short answer is the Jewish Nazi was living there, and that is the reason why they were pointing to Narbonne. So do you see how the Jews and the Muslims are basically both involved together, pointing at the same locations? This is like massive. And some of those mosques in Iran could very well be synagogues for all we know, because that early few centuries is a bit muddy, and there were definitely Jews living in Iran, so we're nearly there. Hope I haven't put you all to sleep, but I think it's fascinating stuff. So here's an appendix with those synagogues pointing to Narbonne. Okay, so I think maybe at a future time I will open up Google Earth and take a zoom into these locations, show you the actual streets, show you the walls and how they point towards towards Narbonne. I think that might be good follow-up. All right. Just stop here for a second. I have an image here from a book from 1991 showing a link from Bar Kokhba through the ages, saying Jews were teachers to Muhammad. Wow, they were on the ball there. Yeah, I'd love to hear more on that one. Yeah. Okay, please do like. Only 28 thumbs up now. Yeah, come on, people. 56 people, 28 thumbs up. I don't know if YouTube is playing games, because sometimes I feel that they hide some of the thumbs up, but I could be wrong. No, so let's just refer to a Maltese viewer. I don't know if our Maltese viewer wants his name mentioned, so just being careful here. So won't mention his name. He will be on our channel in the future. He's working on a presentation in relation to the history of Malta and how it's connected with Islam. So that'll be fascinating. But he gave me this really interesting reference. In the Maltese notarial acts of Giacomo Zabara from the 15th century, AD, synagogues were called meskita in Maltese, which sounds very similar to the word mezquita in Spanish, which means mosque. Right? So we have evidence. Not only we've seen the kind of overlap between synagogues and mosque already in the Qibla data, but we actually are seeing evidence in the Maltese language of synagogues being called mosques. Yeah, so there's something in all of this, you know. Now, I have referred to the relationship between the Jews and Muslims given to us with the writings of Benjamin of Tudela, and I know in the paper, A.J. Juice comes back to that just to point out that there was this close relationship between both sides for the first few centuries, something that has been forgotten in today's world with all the conflict between Iran and Israel and so on. But that actually ultimately might be the source for this aggro between both sides, which seems to be especially strong. Sometimes former friends become the worst of enemies. So what does it all mean? Well, in part 2, we're going to explore its meaning. We're going to go into the consequences of all of this. And I'm sure you all have got various ideas as to what all this means. So please feel free to leave comments in terms of what does it mean that there are mosques pointing towards Baghdad and Narbonne and Girona, and why is it that both synagogues and mosques were pointing to common locations where there were Jewish leaders, and in the case of Baghdad, there was also Muslim leaders as well. Any final comments? Please feel free to share those, and I'll be happy to respond to them. So if you've got any burning questions, I'll see if I can answer them. I'll give it a minute or so, and then we'll call it a day. I'll just point out this from earlier. Girona and Al-Ajirana are very similar. Yeah, could be something that might be worth investigating. Okay, so that's it, I think. I don't think anyone has any other comments. So I'm going to leave it at that for today. I hope you found that interesting and enlightening, and we're going to continue this series in the next few days. I expect this series could probably run to maybe 10 parts because the paper is such a long paper, and there's so much in it. I'm recording more videos this week with Jay Smith, which is on the Mehmed occurrences, and I hope to introduce some of this new material there as well. So look out for that. And that's it from me. Thanks a lot for dropping by. Talk to you all very soon.